Unindoctrinated show with Jordan Cohen. My name's Jordan Cohen. It's so good to be here today. And we're going to get right into it with our free flow form and talk about a few different things. And I'm just going to keep the flow going. And it's interesting. Recently, my girl got this book on medical, survival medicine handbook, and what to do to treat different medical emergencies that one might come across if they're somewhere away from society or a hospital or a doctor, things like that. And I just wanted to start out right off the bat, and maybe I'm just doing this for selfish reasons, or maybe just to try to get some clickbait. I don't know if that's the case, but let's get right into treating a gunshot wound. And treating a bullet wound off the grid can be challenging. So it's got different steps here, and I'm just going to talk about them real quick. The first thing is to determine the extent of the injury, including areas that appear unlikely to be involved at first glance. So determine the extent of the injury from a gunshot wound, and that includes areas that appear unlikely to be involved at first glance. So let's say you get shot in the shoulder, or you know someone that got shot in the shoulder. You want to determine the extent of that shoulder bullet wound injury, but you also want to examine other areas of the body that appear unlikely to be involved at first glance. So you want to do a quick look over, make sure nothing else is going on. First thing you want to do is stop the bleeding. Sounds like common sense. Stop the bleeding. Use direct pressure tourniquets, a hemostatic dressing as needed. The tourniquet is the first course of action in severe hemorrhage. Tourniquet is the first course of action in severe hemorrhage from a bullet wound, gunshot wound. You want to treat for shock. Place an appropriate position for the injury. So, such as with the legs elevated above the level of the heart for a lower extremity wound. A lower extremity wound. So if there's a lower extremity wound, you want to place the legs elevated above the level of the heart for a lower extremity wound. Don't do this for abdominal, head, or chest wounds. So only if it's a lower extremity. Don't do it for an abdominal, head, or chest. Bullet. Someone gets shot. Evaluate for damage circulation and nerve function near the entry and exit wound. So hopefully it'll be a through and through. But you want to evaluate for damage to circulation and nerve function near the entry and exit. Prevent heat loss by covering the casualty. If you got blankets, etc. Once the bleeding has stopped and your patient is in a controlled environment, then you want to irrigate the wound with enough fluids to eliminate debris. So if there's stuff around the wound, you want to irrigate it. You got like a squirt bottle, something like that. Something to irrigate the wound to eliminate any stuff that's going on around the wound the wound, the bullet wound from a gunshot. And this is for treating a gunshot wound. Irrigate the wound with enough fluids to eliminate debris. Pack the wound with a sterile gauze. Cover with a compression dressing. And this is after you've got the person in a controlled environment the best you can. Something away from the elements. Cover with a compression dressing, such as the emergency bandage. It's called an Israeli battle dressing. And you guys can look this stuff up. I'm just going through this right quick. Like I said, this is the Unindoctrinated show, and you know, I'm just reading this stuff from this survival medicine handbook. And it's interesting. You order this, and it's it's got all kinds of stuff in here, and I'll just show it to you right here. If you're watching the video, you see the survival medical handbook by this doctor and his wife. I guess she's also some type of nurse. But they go through all these things like, hey, this is not a, so they don't want to have any liability concerns. But nonetheless, they put out new versions of this every so often. And so right now we're talking about treating a gunshot wound if you get shot. And first thing you do, just to rehash what we're talking about today. In these crazy times, you never know. Somebody might get shot and you don't know what to do. Maybe you've downloaded this podcast episode and maybe that'll help a little bit, but you determine the extent of the injury, including areas that appear unlikely to be involved at first glance. Stop the bleeding. Use direct pressure tourniquets and hemostatic dressings as needed. The tourniquet is the first course of action you want to do in severe hemorrhage. Get that tourniquet on there. Treat for shock. Place in appropriate position. Such as with the legs elevated above the level of the heart, only for lower extremity wounds though. Don't do this for abdominal, head, or chest wounds. Evaluate the damage for circulation and nerve function near the entry and if there's an exit wound. Prevent heat loss by covering the casualty. And once the bleeding has stopped and you want to get your patient into a controlled environment, and to me that means outside of the elements, somewhere, at least in some type of tent, to where things aren't happening. You want to irrigate the wound. Once you get them in that controlled environment with enough fluids to eliminate the debris, you want to clean that wound off. Pack the wound with sterile gauze the best you can. Cover with a compression dressing. And there's a compression dressing known as an Israeli battle dressing. I've never heard that term before. I'll have to look that up. And like I said, my name's Jordan Cohen. You're listening to the Unindoctrinated show. And I don't try to say that I'm knowing anything, but I'm going from this book that talks about treating a plethora of medical emergencies one might encounter if they're away from society, away from a hospital, away from a doctor, and you have to be the doctor. So once you get the patient, and we're talking about a gunshot wound, into a controlled environment, you've stopped the bleeding, you've put the pressure on with the tourniquets. You've evaluated for damage. You want to prevent heat loss by covering. If you got blankets or something to prevent heat loss. Irrigate the wound. Once you get them in a tent or a controlled environment, irrigate the wound with enough fluids to eliminate the debris. Pack the wound with a sterile gauze. Cover with a compression dressing. And it's such as an Israeli battle dressing. And then, also known as the emergency bandage. And you guys can look that up. So that's interesting. And if you got comments, you can comment in the comments section. If you got any better ideas. I'm just going through this emergency gunshot wound in case you know someone that gets shot and you're away from society and you're out in the middle of nowhere. Cover it with a Israeli battle dressing, also known as the emergency bandage. The next step, perform wound cleanings and dressings changes twice a day. So you want to clean the wound and change the dressing on it twice a day. You want to give oral and topical antibiotics, which is sometimes controversial. So keep that in mind. And by the way, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm just going by this medical survival handbook and what they're suggesting in case there's a gunshot wound and you're out away from society. When you want to watch the patient for signs of rebleed or wound infection. Watch out for fever, spreading redness, warmth in the area of the wound, foul odor, or pus. So it goes on to say, in some open wounds, studies show little benefit from preventative antibiotic therapy, but off the grid you can expect dirt. Off the grid you can expect dirt, bits of clothing, and other debris to have been pushed into the wound by a bullet or even a knife. In other words, these wounds are most likely to be dirty, and antibiotics may be appropriate if you've got them. Obviously, if you're out in the middle of nowhere, you may not have access to antibiotics. Of course, it would be ideal to have gloves and other supplies on hand at the time the wound has occurred, but this won't often be the case. So, and just to say, and they go on to say here, and again, this is not suggesting, this is just what's put in this survival medical handbook, and the authors do a lot to distance themselves from any liability, so they treat this as kind of like it says the essential guide for when help is not on the way, but once you go inside they take all kinds of liability because they don't want to be saying, hey, I told this person to do this and that's what they did. So it's really in the legalities kind of put as a entertainment guide, and it's not really. So that's the way they can talk about survival when you're off grid when it comes to medical issues. And today we're just talking about treating a gunshot wound. In some open wounds, studies show little benefit from antibiotics. So keep that in mind. Off the grid, you can inspect dirt, bits of clothing, and other debris that may have been pushed into the wound by a bullet or even a knife. In other words, these wounds are most likely to be dirty, and antibiotics may be appropriate. It'd be ideal to have gloves and other medical supplies immediately on hand at the time the wound has occurred, but this won't often be the case, and that's the reason why we have this book. And today I just wanted to highlight treating a gunshot wound. When modern medical care is available, bullets are usually removed surgically. In austere settings, however, when you're away from everything, you will want to avoid digging into tissue for a hidden bullet. And even though there are instruments for this purpose, nearby nerves and blood vessels may be damaged by your exploration when you're trying to dig out the bullet if it wasn't a through and through. And so that's why I'm saying a through and through is usually the safer bet. But that's not always the case. And if it's not the case, you don't want to be digging in there unless you really kind of know what you're doing. And contamination may lead to infection, and that's another something else you want to keep in mind. The medic, which would be you in this case, treating someone, and you're not a doctor, I'm not a doctor. And this is just suggestions from a medical survival handbook. The medic must realize that the retained bullet itself is a possible source of infection. And so the use of antibiotics may prevent a severe infection in an austere setting. They like to use the phrase austere setting. I like the fancy English. And I'm just a simple guy. And I don't pretend to know much of anything. It goes on, a historical example that illustrates this well is the case of President James A. Garfield in 1881. President Garfield was shot by an assassin. And in their rush to remove the bullet, more than a dozen different physicians probed the wound with their ungloved hands. We're talking about 1881 now with James A. Garfield. I guess the aseptic approach really hadn't been around that long. Surgery and those things were going on long before doctors knew to wear gloves or wash their hands even. And when I was a tattoo artist, we had to pass all kinds of tests about the aseptic approach and the different types of diseases that can be spread, etc., and how to keep your tattoo station and the tattoo shop clean and all that good stuff. And so when I was tattooing down in South Beach, that's what we had to do. We had to adhere to the aseptic approach. That's why we always wore gloves. That's always we changed the needles. Put the needles in the proper dispensary. So today we're talking about treating a gunshot wound, though. We're not talking about tattooing. And James A. Garfield, the president, James A. Garfield, was shot in 1881, and there were a dozen different physicians probed that wound with their ungloved hands and various instruments, and you can bet that they were not sterile, or certainly not sterilized. Now, the injury, which would not have been mortal, became infected for this reason. And so if you're treating a gunshot wound, you don't want to make it worse by infecting the area. And as a result, the president died after a month in agony. James A. Garfield, shot by an assassin in 1881, and if he had been treated properly and not by a dozen different physicians in ungloved hands, and I'm guessing using non-sterile instruments, digging around to try to get the bullet out, caused the area to become infected. And as a result, James A. Garfield died a month later. So think twice before removing a projectile that isn't clearly visible and easily reached. If you can't see the bullet in the hole and you're not a doctor, don't be digging around. And then it goes on, kind of wrap this part of the show up real quick. Treating a gunshot wound when you're in an austere setting, as they like to say, or if you're off grid somewhere. So after you've got these steps that we've been talking about on under control, bed rest, hydration, cleanliness, the adequate iron-rich nutrition will help speed recovery. And help boost the immune system to help your casualty. They refer to it as a casualty, but I would say your loved one or whoever you're with, your friend, your relative, someone in your expedition party that's out in the middle of nowhere, gets shot by a gunshot wound. And nowadays, since we talk about the Unindoctrinated show and what's going on in culture, and I like to ask the question, what is the cultural hegemony? What's the dominant thing that's kind of directing culture and influencing human behavior? And so that's a big question. There can a lot of different things can be going on at the same time. Two opposite things can be true at the same time. So we can dig into that a little bit. And I don't have any definite answers. This is not a show about giving you clear and concise answers. And, what I like to talk about, and one of the things that I like to say on this show, is that oftentimes we'll see these experts come on and pontificate and expound and use their, they're kind of like relying on they're resting on the foundation of maybe their schooling they got, and their degree that they got. And it allows them to pretend that they're professional. But oftentimes, and then a little bit of time goes on, and we find out that, no, that's not actually true after all. And so when I talk about science and the scientific method, it's good to keep your knees bent. But the scientific method is the closest way we can come to forming some type of objective truth, or what I like to say on this show, and the phrase that I coined, cultural objective truth. What is that? What does that mean? Where are we as a society? What are the Generation Alphas going to be like? And when we talk about the latest gen, you got the boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, and now we have Generation Alpha. which was, I guess, born between 2010 to the present. So anyone really, Generation Alphas are the ones that are fully integrated into the global connectivity of what we are now, where we are now with the social media and AI and the computer environment, fully connected. Is it causing people to redefine humanity? Is that a positive thing, or is it a detrimental thing? Are there things that we should be pushing or put forth as far as human behavior goes that would be beneficial not only to the current new generation, but to all of us? And so how do we negotiate all these things? And I don't have an answer. I have stories I can talk about. There seems to be at least with the millennials and Gen Z, I guess especially, there's like bigger problems when it comes to like mental health. There's these different ways of defining what it is to be a human being. Gender seems to be a word that seems to be disappearing. Whereas how people identify themselves, how do people connect with each other? When I was younger, and a lot of us were younger, we didn't have computers, we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have smartphones. We'd go out and meet somebody, and we had to actually physically put the effort in and the energy in to go out and connect with other people. The phone was attached to a cord. In public, there was the payphone, and I did a quick stint at University of Maryland back in 1985, and I rented a room at Sigma Nu fraternity. They asked me to rush, but I said no. I had my own game plan going back then. I was happy I was living there. I was already there. I was already in the frat. I was already in the frat house. I was renting a room in the house, in the frat house. Anyone knows University of Maryland? It's kind of a big university. I don't know what the student body is now. Probably about 40,000, something like that. So it was big. And there was a payphone across the street, and there was a fork stashed. When you reach up, there's a payphone, and you reach up, there's a fork, and then in the microphone that you speak into, there's the little holes, where you speak into that little speaker, the plastic cap that screw on. You guys know what I'm talking about, if you remember what payphones are like. I guess they still got them now at airports and whatnot, and you have to use your credit card and whatever. It's different now, but back then, everything was analog. And so there was a hole that punched through this plastic cap, and underneath the plastic cap, after you screw the cap off, there's another plastic cap under there. And you have to punch a hole through that, and then there's this metal part underneath, and you need like a knife or something sharp, like an owl, to like punch through there. And so when I was at University of Maryland, College Park, Maryland, at Sigma Nu fraternity, there was a payphone across the street. And after I got kicked out of Carnegie Mellon University, I have to say that I'm proud of that. Anyways, I'll get back into that in a moment, but I had a girlfriend up there in Pittsburgh, and calling back then, there were long distance charges, and there was no cell phones, and we didn't have a phone in my room. So if I wanted to call someone, and so they had a fork there, and it was already pre-holed. There was a hole in there, and what you do is, if you wanted to make local calls, or long distance calls even, there was another thing for that. I'll talk about the phone dialer and the Radio Shack dialer back then that we used to make long distance calls, but I didn't find out about that until I was in California. But if you're making local calls, normally you need to put a quarter in the machine or a dime. Back then it was a dime. Then it was a quarter. Cost a dime to make a phone call. So when you were calling friends and stuff, and you weren't at home, and you were younger, and you're living with your mom and your dad, and they're paying the phone bill when you're in middle school or whatnot, or junior high, or high school, they had phones on the copper lines, and there was a phone bill that would come in every month, and long distance charges were more expensive. Nowadays with smartphones and cell phones, you get the one charge. You can pretty much call anywhere in the country. If you move to another part of the country, hell, you can keep your area code from where you just lived. It doesn't matter because it's all generic now in that way. You're not getting charged extra. But if you wanted to make local calls back in 1985 on a payphone, you could do it for free. And there was a fork that we had in the phone booth, and the hole was already made into the speaker part of the phone. And some of you guys know what I'm talking about. You can leave the comments, talk about your experience with it. And so what you do is you'd stick the fork in there, and the fork had like 3 of the tongs like pushed back, so there was just one tong. And you'd stick the tong in there to where it hit the metal part, and you'd have it in there, right? And then you dial and back then it was only a 7-digit number. You didn't even need the area code. But now there's like a zillion people living on the planet, so every time, you need that area code now. But you dial the first 6 numbers, and then you ground the metal fork, the other end of it, to the phone apparatus itself. There's like a metal plate they had on there. There's usually a keyhole where whenever the technician would come by, they take all the coins and stuff out of that, and so it'd stay empty so people could keep using the phone. And that's how they did it back then. So you dial the 6 numbers, you ground it to that metal plate, you dial the last number, you ground it, you'd release it, dial the last number, and then ground it again. If anyone remembers exactly how you do that, leave that in the comments. But I'm pretty sure that's how you do it. Later on, when I was in California, Radio Shack used to sell these phone dialers. It was a little electronic dialer, and this is when chips started coming out. Computers were, pretty much just, nobody had any computers or anything yet. Nobody had any cell phones. Back in those days, it was like the only people with a cell phone had the ones that you have in a car or whatever, that had, it looked like this big, like 5-pound thing, and it was like rich people had those, and they're like their Mercedes and whatnot. But nobody had any cell phones back then. That didn't exist. When I was in 10th grade, the first computer came out with, DOS or whatever. So it wasn't really that interesting unless people really had that computer bug and learned it. And I got friends that did and can go back and walk back through that whole history. Maybe I'll have some of them on the show at some point. But right now we're just doing the free flow format with the Unindoctrinated show with Jordan Cohen. My name is Jordan Cohen. It's great to be here today with everybody talking about these different and various things. And so that's how we made phone calls back in the day. Now, when I had that Radio Shack dialer, this crazy guy showed me how to do it. And what you do is you go to Radio Shack, you get the dialer. It was like, I don't know, $10 or $20 or something like that. It wasn't that big. And all it was a thing that stored phone numbers. So when you picked up the phone, it just, instead of like punching in the numbers, you could just have everyone on your address book, and it stored like, I don't know how many numbers, but it stored a bunch. And then you just push the button and then stick that dialer up to the speaker, and it will just dial the number for you. So that way it was kind of like an electronic address book. But we didn't use it for that, because what you do at Radio Shack, they sell these different chips that were made for different things, maybe for, I don't know, electronic little remote control cars and whatnot, or whatever people use their electronic. I'm not an electric computer guy, but they sold these different chips, and you get like a 3.2 megahertz chip. Maybe someone can that knows the details on that. The details. What part of town are you from? Do you say details or you say details, or does it depend on how you're using it? I don't know. Tomato. Anyways, so you get that chip, and then you open up the phone dialer, the Radio Shack phone dialer, made by Radio Shack, and you replace the chip. Take the other chip, the chip that was in there out. You replace it for another chip, and then all you would do is program one sequence in that dialer after that, which was the star key. When you hit the star key, it mimics the exact tone of when someone puts a nickel in a payphone. So we'd set the sequence for 5 of those, so it would be a quarter. And so with that, you could go to any payphone, and if you wanted to call halfway around the world, you could. I remember making some long distance calls or whatever. It's like $40, for a phone call, and you're just hitting that dialer saying, the operator, come on, please deposit 90 more cents for the next 3 minutes or whatever. And you just put in $1. You just hit that phone dialer, and you just hit one button, and it mimics boop, 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 boop. 5 quarters or 5 nickels going in, sound of a quarter. And so you just hit that. It was like really quick. And then because if you put a quarter in, that's the sound it makes. Whatever, 5 of them. And so you do that 4 times, so that's $1. So then you have like 10 cents credit at that point. If, let's say, the operator says you need to deposit 90 cents, or let's say they need you to deposit $1.40, and you just put in $2 in, or $1.50, whatever it is, and that way you're always staying ahead, and so the phone doesn't get cut off. So you'll be talking to someone, and then they would come on, and the operator, electronic voice, would be like, please deposit $2.30 for the next 4 minutes. And then you hit that with your phone dialer. And so that's how we used to do it back in the 80s, in the mid 80s, all the way up to the early 90s. And then eventually the phone company caught on and they changed it. And now, of course, that is part of the past, never to be repeated, except maybe if there's copper lines again and the old system is somehow raised for whatever reason. But the way things are going, do not see that happening. I don't see that coming to pass anytime soon, but you never know. And the reason you never know, and I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and that's one of the reasons. And my girl got this book, my beautiful lady. We've both been working out lately, so that's kind of cool. We've both been doing our little fitness routine. She's got her version, I got my version, and it's a beautiful thing. And so she got this survival medicine handbook. It's like $40. But today I was talking about treating a gunshot wound. But you can really go into anything out here, from earthquake survival, head and neck injuries, types of things. mass casualty incidents. I'm just kind of flipping through it here. Diagnosing pregnancy. And these are things, this is a handy bit of information in case you're off the grid or away from any type of medical facility and there's no doctors around. And so it's one of those cool things. She got this other thing to go along with it. We're creating medicines and different things from herbs and plants and all that. It's pretty detailed. So that's a pretty interesting book. I'll be going through that one a little bit. Maybe on the next episode, we'll do a little bit of that. How to do something to get rid of a headache or whatever the case may be. Or if you got some type of something that you can make, medicines that you can make, kind of like the Native American way. So we'll go through that. But we're living in interesting times now, and people aren't sure where things are going. We're in this kind of quantum age. I heard this thing recently that they're talking about gravity doesn't exist. And to me, that just seems kind of obvious. I mean, isn't it obvious that gravity is kind of an illusion or an effect of, but really they dig into it. And when you go to and don't quote me on this, because again, I'm not trying to pretend like I know nothing. I don't know a thing. But I'm trying to roll with this free flow format because I think developing a skill when you can speak clearly, enunciate your words, pronounce correctly, it's important because communication is important. Communication is very important. Communication is arguably the most important thing going on in the world today. And it seems like even though the world is more interconnected than ever, communication seems to be the trickiest and most elusive animal. So communication is important. And so speaking of gravity doesn't exist, when you take an atom and you go maybe a million or a trillion times smaller than an atom, if you zoom in that close and you look at the quantum world, in that world, if you go down in there and peer around, a million times smaller than an atom, a trillion times smaller than an atom. And by the way, the nucleus of an atom, I believe, is already like 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of an atom. So there's a lot of open space there. So once you get down that deep, then there is no gravity. Gravity does not exist. And so gravity is maybe it's when there's more and more of these atoms and everything, when there's more and more of them building up, then it kind of becomes chaotic, and from chaos is organization. And so when we look about the universe today, and on this show, I like to talk about philosophy and where things are going, and I guess my brand of examining reality, the unindoctrinated way. And that way will be defined more and more as time goes on. And on this episode is the 4th episode of the show. And I want to flow it. I want to sling it. I want to sling, freeform, stream of consciousness style. You ever do like freeform writing when you were in school as a kid, where the teacher said, just write, don't put the pen down, write for the next 5 minutes or whatever? I used to do that a lot when I was writing a lot of songs. And for me, I'm just a writer, a fine artist, painter, sculptor, depending on what period of time you're looking at, and a songwriter, musician, guitar player. Lately, I've been re-upping my guitar stuff, and I've been putting some videos out on this channel. I'm going to put some of those original songs and some other stuff, and when I get some other musicians on here, we'll have some impromptu jams. But just as a songwriter, it was important. I spent a lot of years, and when I say a lot of years, I'm talking several decades of writing. And when you do that free flow form writing, the stream of I used to call it SOC, stream of conscious. I know there's another phrase they use in schools for that, like free. I don't know what I can't. It's not. I can't recall it at the moment. But I called it the stream of consciousness writing. And so you just write. And I used to spit out 3-pagers on a regular basis. And every now and then I'd get a wild hair and I'd spit out maybe 50 pages of writing. And maybe most of that's going to be complete nonsense, but you just don't think. You just write what's immediately in your mind, write it down. The sky is gray. The floor has tiles. It's shiny. It needs to be swept. The camera has a matte black finish to it. And I feel kind of crazy, or my head is spinning. My thoughts are twirling around like a ballerina, and I don't know how to slow it down. And I feel if I slow it down, then the ballerina is going to fall over, the ballerina in my mind. I bet nobody ever thought that I had a ballerina in my mind at the moment. Jordan Cohen's got a ballerina in his mind, and she's twirling around. Or maybe it's just a gyroscope that's twirling, and maybe the gyroscopes are off kilter, and you just got to keep moving. I don't know. But when I talk about cultural objective truth, I like to talk about in terms of action. So it has to be, movement has to take place for cultural objective truth to reveal itself. We talk about the double slit experiment, right? In the quantum world, where it doesn't present itself until it's observed, but it can be at 2 places at once. And 2 places at once means an infinite amount of places at once. But the minute it's observed, everything conforms. Whereas before, it could be any direction in an infinite. Here, I like to use a sphere as an example. All the points in the sphere and all the different points of the space inside the sphere. If this was the entire universe, for example, and I'm not saying this is the shape of the universe, I'm saying this is the shape of a squeeze toy for a dog. But it is spherical, and it's got all these points on it, and I painted some of them to just kind of like highlight. And I got this other little cat toy here, and we can spin it around, but it's really like this, isn't it? It's really, right, how it moves. It's not like just spinning around. It's actually, because this is spinning, this is spinning, this is spinning. People have been talking about simulation theory more and more nowadays. It reared its head about 4 or 5 months ago. And actually goes all the way back to the Matrix movies, but really 4 or 5 months ago is when people started talking about astrophysicists and theorists, and it gets getting more and more play nowadays about that we're really all just holograms. But does that really matter? And the answer is no, it really doesn't. It's not going to affect my day today, but it can help inform reality and how to explain it. When you talk about diving into the quantum where gravity doesn't exist, they like to use that painting by George Seurat. I think it's called Sunday Afternoon in the Park. Right? It's pointillism painting. And as a painter, I've done some of those. I've done some pointillism, but I kind of mix it with other things because I'm not living in 18 whatever. We're in the 21st century now. 2024. And so anyways, when you zoom into a pointillist painting, and I used to make this point, but not using that example or anecdote, just whenever you zoom into anything, if you zoom ultra close, it's not going to inform you about what that thing is. Once you get so close and zoom in, you're not going to know what it is. It's just going to be these abstract shapes. It's going to have no meaning. It's not going to tell you that it's a painting of people in a park on a Sunday afternoon. And who knows? Maybe George Seurat named it that because it sounds fanciful and people are relaxing, so he called it. But it could have been maybe Saturday afternoon. I have a painting that I named Friday, I think Friday afternoon, something. And that gives a little different context to it, right? There's some things going on. You think of Friday afternoon, what does that conjure up to you? It means you've had kind of a long day maybe, but you're going to go out that night with your friends or whatever. I can't remember which one is date night with the women. Is it Friday or Saturday? Comment on the comments below, or wherever the comments may be in the format that you're watching. And I think it's a Friday night, you're out with the boys, and Saturday you're out with your woman, or is it the other way around? I don't know. I got my woman, and she's a beautiful woman. And maybe we'll bring her on at some point to talk about some of the things that she does that she's interested in. But she kind of likes to be out of the spotlight and not, not like, it's like we're in this age of like selfies. I remember doing an album cover at one point for this music project I was working on back in the late 90s and early aughts. It kind of spilled into. And I was sitting in the car, and I was in the Northeast somewhere. It was cold, wintertime. So I had my black leather jacket. And I was looking pretty cool. I was younger back then. I wasn't bad looking. You know what I mean? So I took one of those cameras, and there was we didn't have a cell phone. In the early 2000s, when people started getting their, first little flip phone or whatever. So those phones did not have cameras on them. So you'd have to go get a camera. And back then the cameras were like talking about, there was like the first digital cameras. Oh, this got 6 megapixels. Ooh, this one's got 8 megapixels. Ooh, this one's got whatever. And by the way, humans, I believe, see in 276 megapixels or 576 megapixels is what the human eye sees in 576 megapixels, but of course the human eye does not see in megapixels. It's a predictive, and that's the way the human eye works, and it's got different characteristics than maybe like a digital camera that just sees things in terms of megapixels. Human eye does not do that. Lately I've been digging more into philosophy. We haven't got a whole lot into it today, but we've been talking about cultural hegemony. What's the dominant thing that's driving human behavior now? Is it these blown up abstracted stories that you see on news media? that don't really represent the reality of your life and our life, or where things are going? Is it people talking about what they're afraid of and the fears? Is that how different talk show hosts get listeners, by spreading fear about what may happen? Is talk about like the government is going to take over, or a foreign adversary is going to shut down the grid. Now, I'm not saying that won't happen. So there's things to be concerned about. Maybe the grid infrastructure in this country is especially vulnerable. People have comments on that. Talk about it. Let me know. Inform me. Inform the Unindoctrinated show with Jordan Cohen. I'm Jordan Cohen. It's great to be here. And I'm glad you guys are all along with me here for the ride today. It's a beautiful thing. And I just want to acknowledge that by making a quick sound with my sound triangle. And we can acknowledge how great it is that I'm able to do this show and talk about things and talk in my free form flow format, coming right at you. So we want to do it that way. Eventually I'm going to be bringing some guests on, different musicians, comedians, other people, and we're going to be talking about different things, what's going on in culture and society today. And we're talking about, we'll get all into that. And so what is it that you think is the driving force that's affecting human behavior on a macro scale, that affects our daily lives down to our individual daily patterns and our thought patterns, what we think about, what we believe? I've been trying to eat healthy, trying to exercise, trying to keep my mind right, my mental health right. I'm lucky I got a woman in my life. I'm lucky I got family. But these kids nowadays, there's this term called incel. I guess it's like, involuntarily celibate, that guys, I guess they have a hard time connecting with women, or they don't know how to talk to them nowadays with the Gen Z and millennials, maybe. They're not sure because they've been brought up with these electronic devices. And of course, when you have all the pornography in the world at your fingertips, that can influence and affect your brain patterns. So how does that all work? I remember when I was a kid, back in the 70s, growing up in the 1970s, it was like a big ordeal if me and my buddies, were able to like finagle a men. There was called Men's, was one of the magazines that had naked women in it. We would snaggle from a 7-Eleven, and next to the 7-Eleven was a putt golf, and the putt golf. They had an arcade in there for video games and pinball machines and stuff and whatnot. And if you're like middle school age and you can't drive and you can't drink, you go to that putt golf on the weekends, on Friday night or Saturday night, and you hang out because all the different kids would go there, and then you'd see, ooh, there's a hot girl. There's a girl I've never seen before. And it's like this whole thing. Nowadays, that stuff doesn't really exist anymore. And so now you have these different types of labels, like incel, which is just weird to me. I healthily got my heart broken several times over growing up, which is normal, because that means that when you do get in a relationship that works and you kind of understand what you're looking for and what the other person's about, and it doesn't mean you have to be about the same things. It can be about different things that can complement each other. Often that's the case. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes you just match up and it's like you're interested in the exact same thing. To me, that's kind of boring, but whatever. But either way, that's how we all did it. And it seems like kids nowadays, they've been inundated with these communication devices that have made communication harder and more challenging, and have caused mental health and depression. And me, I'm a sensitive guy. I really have to stay on top of my mental health. So for me, I don't drink, I don't do no drugs, but I'm not judging. If people want to have that cocktail at night, well, that's on you, my friend. And I'm not going to kick you out of my band if you like to have that cocktail or you smoke a blunt. If that's your thing, that's cool. And by the way, I have no problem with legalization of substances. I feel like the more substances are legalized, there should be the more education and understanding and critical thinking implemented that are taught. And that's another problem. I heard recently teachers are quitting teaching because they're just tired of being a policeman to other students that can't put down their cell phone. Even if their cell phone vibrates, it distracts. And so that's why the average IQ has been going down since around the turn of the millennium till now, whereas for the past 100 years over the 20th century, the average IQ went up 30 points within that 100-year period. And now it started to dip. And people ask, why is that? And it's maybe different things, but I think a huge part of it is these, once there was the cell phone where you could make cell phone calls and maybe a text message, and that was it. I was doing extra work in the movies back in the 80s, and there was the beeper thing. Remember the whole beeper craze? That was about the same time as the phone dialer from Radio Shack that I was talking about earlier. And there was a beeper store, and the beeper stores are like this big colorful place where it's like all these new cool, I want the magenta colored beeper with the yellow buttons on it, But it was just a beeper. You couldn't make any phone calls with it. Nowadays, you can video and see people and talk to them pretty much whenever you want. A lot of people like to have other people that they can track, so they literally know the location of whoever is on their friends list to know where they're at. Oh, there's Jenny. She's with Billy at halftime liquor. They're down at halftime liquor. Oh, there's Joey and Sharonda. They're at the Final Score Deli. I guess they're getting some big ass subs down at the Final Score Deli sandwich place. And maybe they're watching the game there because they got sports on the TV and the big screen TVs they got in there. Or there's Hank, and there's Joe, and Mike, and Matt. They're all driving together somewhere. Maybe they're heading up to Medford, Oregon. I bet they're in that red F-150 pickup truck, that they borrowed from Joel in East Oakland, California. Maybe they had to get off of East 14th Street. They got tired of the daily barrage of gunshots you hear out there. Maybe they didn't want to get their fast food from Wendy's because you got to get it from behind bulletproof glass nowadays. Hell, a lot of stores now, they're just moving out of town because people are desperate. They'll just steal stuff, and who wants to open up a shop that's going to get robbed and people steal? So that's not good. So businesses are moving. People are on their smartphones. They got their computer in their pocket that has access to pretty much anything they want to ask. They don't even have to type it in now. They can just put on their little AI voice recognition thing and ask it, you know. Where's the nearest Bass Pro Shop? It'll tell you, you know. Where's the nearest golf store where I can get golf supplies? I want to get a new set of clubs because I just got rich and I want to move to a rich area, and I heard everybody has fancy golf clubs and I want to get some. So I'll ask my smartphone, where can I get those clubs at? Because I want to kick ass on my back nine and beat my handicap. So nowadays you can ask your cell phone just about anything, but the one thing your cell phone is not going to do is improve your mental health, and that seems to be a big problem now. There's even terms now like incel, which I guess has been around for a minute, but hey, I'm a latent dude, so I just heard about it recently. But I like to talk about what's the root of human behavior and how does that express itself. And what's going on with the cell phones is it just gotten so good at catering to the human basic, natural, basest tendencies, whereas has human behavior always tried to do that whenever you're selling something in a capitalistic society? You know, or a democratic republic is one way people describe it. People describe this country in other ways, maybe an autocratic republic. I don't know. But so my question is, does modern society today, is it just simply doing something better that we've always tried to do to exploit and take advantage of other people for our own advantage? Is that really the natural thing for humans to do? Are humans really that bad? Are humans... Because it feels good to give. When I went on my run earlier, I went on a little 4-mile run earlier today, and there's some narrow parts where there's a guardrail and the path gets narrow, and people riding their bikes or whatever the other direction. I always like to I give them a heads up ahead of time before they come. I stand off to the side and I do turn sideways and I put my hands in the air. And I did that a few times today, man. And people, they're just like, thank you, man. Thank you. I appreciate that. You have a great day. People say that because most of the time people are just kind of like focused on their own energy. And they think if somebody's kind of coming towards them and getting there in their way, they don't have to move. You know, but my philosophy on that is whoever is moving fastest gets the right of way. Especially if they're riding a bicycle. You know, it happened over the drawbridge today. Heading into Hollywood Beach off of Sheridan. I was running over that drawbridge. And I caught the draw. I caught the boat, some big ass yacht. Probably a I don't know, $10 million yacht or more. Had to go through. I watched it go. And there are people coming across, and it's a thin area there. because you're on the draw. And of course, you're on a bridge, so there's no space, there's no margin on either side. And on the other side, cars are whipping by. So you stand up. If somebody's moving faster than you, or they're taking up the space, and you're just doing your exercise routine, it shouldn't matter. And one thing that does bother me though is like when people are walking like side by side and they're taking up the whole trailway, and you're running up, and there's only room for like 2 people, and you're running the other direction, and they don't want to move, because they're standing side by side. That's kind of rude. It's like you want to be cognizant and present and acknowledge. And by the way, when you do that, and you do that in advance, like I do on a regular basis, especially for bicyclists, because I really do get off to the side and I put my arms to the side, almost like a crossing guard, or like a referee, like calling for a touchdown with his hands up, not straight up, but kind of 45 degrees, and I'll wave. I'll send out some positive energy, and I always see this big smile on their face, like, thank you, man, thank you, because if the trail's narrow, they don't want to get off their bike just because you're running the other direction. Yeah, I'm the one that's running. I don't got a big apparatus. It doesn't take any energy for me to just kind of stop for a second, stand to the side. I'm not like in this huge race. I'm just doing my little 4-mile run. And my little workout. It's not a big deal. It's not going to make me less in shape because I decided not to get out of the way of someone and be cognizant of someone else's energy. And it's the same thing with conversation. And I make this mistake a lot. My girlfriend will tell you, I cut her off all the time. I try not to do it. But I do it anyways, and she reminds me, and it's funny because I talk about acknowledging the energy of the other person. And so when you're having a conversation, I talked about this on the last episode. When you're having a conversation with somebody, you want to acknowledge what they're saying. You don't have to agree with it. And maybe you're not even interested in what they're saying. Maybe your mind is elsewhere and you got other things on your mind. But it's important to listen and comprehend and acknowledge what the other person's talking about first. You have to acknowledge what they're saying first. And I still make mistakes. Sometimes I'll say something and then I acknowledge what they're saying. And that's not right either. You need to do it first. There's a method, there's an appropriate method when it comes to human interaction and communication. And the appropriate method, in my opinion, and I think I'm right, is when somebody is talking to you, you acknowledge what they're saying, respond to what they're saying, so they know that you comprehended what they were talking about. And then you can jizzle out whatever thoughts are on your mind after that. And usually none of that's really that important anyways. If you're like me, I got a lot of thoughts floating around in my head all the time. And most of it, nobody really needs to hear. But so when it comes to communication, what is the dominant force, the cultural hegemony that's directing human behavior today? So your thoughts on that, comment on that if you want. The root of human behavior, the root of human behavior, how does that express itself? And does modern society, has it set itself up to maximize the most basest tendencies of human behavior? Like if it's like a marketing campaign for the basest tendencies and oftentimes the least desirable tendencies. And that seems to be, and maybe I'll get on this on the next episode, why we hold up so many people that, in my opinion, really have no talent and are complete morons. But we seem to hold them up because they seem to be, like outlawish. You can be a bad mofo. You can be a bad motherfucker without having to be stupid and obnoxious and narcissistic and self-centered and pretend like everything that you do and everything, what's the word, solipsism? Solipsism where you recognize your own mind, but that's it. Anything else outside of that in your entire reality is just a fabrication, so it really doesn't mean anything. Am I getting that word right? I don't know. Comment if you got something to say about it. But just to wrap this show up, and it looks like we're going on a little bit today. So I guess my free flow format is slowly improving. I want to do like 50 of these shows, 50, before I start bringing some guests on, but maybe that won't happen. Maybe I'll bring some guests on sooner than that. And we'll have a conversation, and I will test my conversation skills, put them to the test, see how we do, see if we can have an interesting, intelligent, and captivating, and motivating, and inspirational conversation, flowing out words that have meaning and truth behind it. And this show is all about cultural objective truth and what that means and how we define it. I see it as an action word. But anyways, just to wrap this show up, I just want to thank everybody for sticking with me this whole time. I know it's been a long one. Next time it probably won't be quite as long, but I wanted to get down and gritty with it and talk about the survival medicine handbook. And just kind of go through that with a gunshot wound and all that stuff and wrap that up. But listen, thank you all so much for joining me today on the Unindoctrinated show with Jordan Cohen. My name's Jordan Cohen, and it's been such an honor to be here today, and I'll see you on the next one.